All right, so thanks everyone for being here. This is, obviously an important issue, and one of the things that I want to think about is the way that we can respond to the problem of the opioid epidemic, sort of in virtue of the different roles we find ourselves in. So there are basically two problems that motivate the talk. One of them is a practical problem, one of them is something you might think of as a philosophical problem. So the practical problem is just that there are way too many people dying of opioid-related overdoses. This is, as I'll talk about later on in the talk, a really serious problem. And this gives rise to this sort of moral philosophical problem about the appropriate police response to this problem. So you can have discussions about how healthcare professionals should respond to it, how people in different parts of the community should respond. I'm largely interested in what a good policing response to this problem looks like. Okay, so first what I'll do is clarify the nature of the problem, and then I'll offer a partial solution. And that's going to be borrowing harm reduction tools that are sort of pioneered in the public health sphere, and thinking about how we can apply those in the police sphere. So a provocative way to put this is that harm reduction in policing is actually a kind of broken windows policing. And so if you are familiar with broken windows policing, I think you'll agree that is rather provocative. So just a quick clarification of the terms. An opiate is any drug derived from the opium plant, and an opioid is any drug that binds with opioid receptors in the brain. So this means there are sort of natural and synthetic opioids, and they've got sort of different roles in the problem that we're seeing. So opioids include things like heroin, codeine, oxycodone, fentanyl, naloxone, and so on. So you're probably familiar with OxyContin because it is probably the most successful pharmaceutical drug or product ever created. The Sackler family has made billions of dollars on this. And for a while it was a leading cause or a primary cause of deaths associated with opioid overdoses. Probably familiar with fentanyl. Fentanyl has been in the news lately because it has become one of the most serious contributors to opioid overdose deaths. Fentanyl is dangerous because it's synthetic. There are a lot of different opioids that sort of fall under the name fentanyl. So it can be really difficult to gauge sort of the potency of this drug. So what we have here is what's supposed to be a lethal dose of heroin next to a lethal dose of fentanyl and a lethal dose of carfentanil. So the fact that these are so much more potent than heroin, combined with the fact that they're often mixed into the drugs that you'll buy on the street, can make this really difficult for users of the drug to gauge the potency, right? And it can lead to accidental overdoses. Fentanyl's often used in the veterinary industry. So there's my dog after a knee surgery. He's got a fentanyl patch on his side there. He looks to me like he's really enjoying it. But again, this is like a controlled dose, right? It's okay in some circumstances, not necessarily in others. So you may know of Narcan, which is a name brand of naloxone that is often available to first responders. What we use Narcan for is if you see someone in the process of overdosing, you can give them this drug. Often you give it to them nasally, and this blocks the opioid receptors from taking in any more of the opiates. And in so doing can halt the fatal overdose. So now this brings me to the thing that I'm primarily interested in, which is a philosophical question, a moral question about whether police officers ought to be equipped with Narcan. So somewhere around 2,500 police departments nationwide have started carrying it. And in a sense, it borrows a tool from the harm reduction strategy pioneered elsewhere. And the thought here is that what we should be doing, at least partially, for our response to the epidemic is engaging in practices that make it less likely that people will be harmed, make it less likely that people will die as a result of this drug use, with the ultimate goal of helping to get people off of the drug. So it's effective in a lot of cases at reducing the overdose death rate, but there's a question about whether it counts as good policing, right? So not too far from here, you have the Claremont Sheriff, Steve Leahy, who says, from my personal experience, equipping officers with Narcan is the right thing to do. Right? He's aware of the fact that this is controversial, and not too far from him is Butler Sheriff Richard Jones, who disagrees. He says it's just not what we do, right? We won't do it, period. And so the thought here is that this is just bad policing, right? Independently of whether it reduces death rates, independently of whether it reduces the harm that's wrought by the opioid epidemic, this is just not what police officers are supposed to do. It's just bad policing. So what I want to do is try to adjudicate this philosophical difference, right? Because that's ultimately what this is. You might not think of this as a philosophical difference. Perhaps the officers themselves don't. But ultimately, it's a dispute about the nature of good policing, right? So this is ultimately a philosophical, value-based question. So what I want to do then is look at the sort of standard law enforcement response to the problem of drug use in communities and argue that the harm reduction approach is something that counts as good policing, right? So here we have this graphic is from the New York Times. This shows you what the overdose death rate is like from 1990 all the way up to 2018. So we've just got a really steady increase, right? And to sort of put this into perspective, there were 17,000 homicides reported in 2016 compared to around 60,000 overdose deaths, right? So this is a problem that's like significantly larger than some of the other problems that police officers are used to facing. So here we have 40,000 gun deaths. That's the peak gun death rate in 2017. In 95, peak HIV deaths got to about 46,000 or so. In 1972, peak car crash deaths topped 50,000. So all of these things that we rightly think of as really, really serious health problems, really serious problems in like the numbers of deaths that we're seeing, the opioid epidemic has surpassed all of these. It's a really serious problem, right? And that means that it's really important that we get our response to it right. That means that we don't want to sort of put off the table things that might be helpful. So this graphic right here gives you an indication of which drugs are the most serious. So 47,000 overdose deaths involved in opioid. This is in 2018. 32,000 of those involved a synthetic opioid like fentanyl. 15,000 involved heroin, and about 13,000 involved common prescription opioids. And what's interesting, and this will become important later on, is that while we see an upward trajectory for opioid deaths, and we see a massive spike for fentanyl-related deaths right around 2012, 2013, we're getting a drop-off in prescription opioid deaths and a leveling off of heroin deaths. All right, and as I said, this is going to become important later on. It's also important to understand that this problem is not national in a sense. In a sense, it's deeply regional, right? And that's the case for a lot of criminal justice problems. So West Virginia has it the worst. These are deaths out of 100,000, 53 involving opioids in general, 35 involving fentanyl. What we see is a drop-off in a lot of these starting in 2017, but a pretty massive spike in the share of deaths attributed to fentanyl. In Indiana, fentanyl is not quite the problem it is in places like West Virginia or Maryland, right? So the numbers in 2017 are about 30 deaths per 100,000 in Indiana, with 1.6 of those attributed to fentanyl. So again, these problems are different in different places, and it will be useful to allow law enforcement agencies to respond using the sort of local knowledge available to them. All right, and just to clarify, right, you might think, well, the population has been going up in this time, so maybe the problem is just there are more people. But when we break this out into the deaths per 100,000, you see this steady uptick, and right around 2013 or so, it starts to go up pretty significantly. So we'll want to try to figure out what the cause of that is, so that we can figure out the appropriate way to respond. Now, a lot of people rightly are concerned about prescription opioids, though, as I've indicated, this isn't the whole problem, right? So this is a map of the counties in Indiana, 2017. So the darker blue equals higher opioid prescription rates on the left, and on the right, the darker blue indicates higher overdose death rates. And so what you see is, the most populated areas are having more overdose deaths, but we don't see like a direct relationship between opioid prescription rates and overdose death rates. Okay, so to back up a little bit, we want to sort of get a fuller perspective on the nature of the epidemic here. And so there was this realization in medicine a couple decades ago that pain was being undertreated. There are lots of people who just weren't getting the kind of treatment they needed for the pain that they were experiencing, and so people started talking about pain as another vital sign, right? And there's this realization we need to do something about this. And prescription opioid companies sort of misled people about how addictive their options were, right? So they downplayed the risk of addiction in their marketing for about a couple years before we realized that this was problematic and put a stop to this. And what we see is that demand for prescription opioids goes up, and there were some sort of entrepreneurial doctors who tried to step in and fill that role. And this was a really serious problem in Florida, right? So these places would sort of crop up, and their main goal was just to get people to buy opioids from them, right? And so here we have the South Florida Pain Clinic. This is what people call a pill mill. So you have a bunch of people just waiting in line to get their opioids. And at one time, the majority of the sort of gray market prescription opioids that were entering communities were coming from Florida. Now, we've since stopped this, and I'll talk more about that in a minute, but it's worth sort of thinking about the sort of stereotypical crack house of the 80s and the pill mill of the 2000s, right? So I don't want to, again, downplay the significance of this problem, but what we do see is quite a bit less violence associated with the distribution of this drug, and it's partly because it's not fully black market, right? What we have here is a gray market, and so in some sense, right, that is interesting all by itself. Okay, so what we have then is a small uptick in overdose deaths in the mid-80s, right? This is associated with the crack epidemic, substantial increase in the 90s, and an even more dramatic increase beginning in the 2000s. And this isn't sort of equally attributable to all of the drugs, right? So what we see in the early 2000s is prescription overdose deaths rising, taking up a bulk of, or accounting for a bulk of the problem. Right around 2010, prescription deaths taper off and heroin deaths increase. And then a few years after that, the heroin deaths continue to increase, but we see fentanyl causing a really, really serious problem here, right? And so the opioid epidemic comes in 3 stages, right? First, we have the prescription drugs sort of kicking this off. We get sort of a legal response to this, which I'll talk about in a minute. And then with this sort of crackdown on prescription drugs, you get alternatives sort of filling the void here, right? And again, those are heroin and fentanyl. Okay, so what to do, right? That's the nature of the problem. What's the solution? So for a long time, people have basically said something like, well, that's what the police are for. People are doing something we don't want them to do. Let's use the tools of law enforcement, right? But this doesn't actually end up answering the question, because there are a lot of ways that the police can respond to this problem. And so we need to ask this philosophical question, this ethical question about policing, to figure out what the proper police response is, right? So the typical response has been what I'll call a law enforcement response. And this echoes the Sheriff Jones claim that what we do is we make arrests and we incarcerate people, right? We don't do things like carry Narcan. We just make arrests, we help prosecutors bring cases, and we hope that by increasing the incarceration rate, we will deter people from this behavior. Now the problem is that you're probably aware of the fact that there's a very long history of prohibition and law enforcement in the United States. So we can go back to alcohol prohibition, beginning of the 20th century, which sort of famously associated with the rise in organized crime, and massively unsuccessful, no actual elimination of the problem here, right? Rather, what you see is an increase in potency. So whereas prior to Prohibition, people primarily consumed things like beer and wine, after Prohibition, for sort of easily understood reasons, you get an increase in the consumption of hard liquor. Why is that? Because if you're smuggling the stuff in, you want something that's more compact. And we see the same sort of thing happening, right? One of the reasons why fentanyl has become more of a problem lately is because it's just more potent, right? So you can bring more in with roughly the same amount of risk. So what I want to do is look at briefly the relationship between incarceration and crime. Because one of the things that we've seen is that incarceration is usually not a particularly effective way of getting people to avoid doing the thing that we don't want them to do, right? And I should clarify that this is not a criticism of the police. I think rather we should understand this as a criticism of the political sensibilities that go into making this a politically attractive view, right? Say, well, people are doing bad stuff, let's sort of lock them up and throw away the key. And it turns out that this is, up until recently, been an incredibly popular response, a bipartisan response, right? And so this is, again, not primarily a problem with policing, but a problem with our political response to it, right? So here we have the homicide rate, relatively steady up until the 60s, and we get a big spike in crime, and that stays consistent until about 1994, when we get a massive drop in the homicide rate. Okay? And this is one of the sort of central puzzles of criminology. Why is it that we saw such a massive decline in crime in '94? Well, it's probably not because of incarceration. So here we have the number of state and federal prisoners, the rate of state and federal incarceration, and it stays about constant up until the 80s, and then it starts to take a pretty massive increase, right? And notice that the increase happens in the 80s, right? Beginning of the 80s, and it continues. So the timing is just not right here. Right? So it's not until about a decade and a half later that you actually start to see a drop-off in crime rates. So here we have, this is the incarceration rate, this is the thicker black dotted line here is the homicide rate, and then the finer black line, these are the 6 index crimes that the FBI tracked. So these include not only homicide, but different kinds of theft, rape, so on and so forth. And notice that these stay about the same while we just get this continual increase in the incarceration rate. So this should make us relatively skeptical about the effectiveness of incarceration as a tool. So now you might think, well, look, these are just index crimes, these have nothing to do with drug crimes, and that's true. So I want to go back to the graphic that we were looking at earlier and see the various kinds of police responses. So here we have in '82, Reagan recommits to the war on drugs. In 1983, Daryl Gates launches the DARE program. So this is a program aimed at sort of educating kids about the dangers of drug and alcohol abuse. In '94, as a part of a new federal crime bill, we get this massive influx of federal cash to hire local police agents. In '99, the police per capita rate peaks. It's been sort of tailing off ever since. SWAT raids, which are used primarily to affect drug arrests, to search for drugs, to serve warrants, reach 40,000 a year in 2001. And notice, again, that this whole time there doesn't seem to be any slowdown in the overdose death rate. And so that means that there's no slowdown in the drugs that people are consuming, right? We get in 2010, and here's where I think things get really interesting, pill mill legislation in Florida. So in 2010, legislation was put on the books to eliminate these pill mills. That was more or less successful. And you also get OxyContin reformulation, right? So Purdue Pharma, the corporation behind OxyContin, introduced a new kind of OxyContin that's supposed to be tamper-proof. So it used to be that you could just crush it up into a powder and consume it that way, and that would bypass the sort of delayed activation of the opioid. And now, if you try to crush it up, you just get this sort of like gummy substance, right? And so this is supposed to keep you from using the drug recreationally. Now, in a sense, that has been successful in reducing the amount of prescription opioid abuse. But if you want to consume something and the thing that you want to consume is no longer available to you, that doesn't mean that you're just going to stop, right? It means you're probably going to seek out alternatives and try to substitute that. And that's exactly what happens, right? So in 2010, we get these two sort of shocks to the system that are aimed at eliminating prescription abuse, and yet what happens is people substitute, right? So 2010, a couple of years after that, we get the massive fentanyl spike. 2010, you get a drop-off in these prescription overdose deaths and a pretty substantial increase in the rate at which people are dying from heroin use. So the sort of heroin epidemic as a part of the opioid epidemic is in large part a response to this problem. So again, right, the point here is that it turns out that the sort of standard law enforcement, incarceration-driven response, not particularly effective. And the reason is because, right, people have these preferences to use drugs, and telling them that they can't is often not a useful way of responding, right? And so people, in fact, had a preference for the prescription opioids because they knew what they were getting, right? They knew exactly what they were getting. They could go to the store, more or less, and buy it. And there was like less uncertainty about the product they were consuming. But once you become addicted, once you really want to consume these drugs, you will turn to substitutes, and that's exactly what people do, right? So I want to reiterate here, though, that the point is not that these strategies are entirely ineffective. Rather, the point is that they're not fully effective, right? It's probably never going to be the case that we'll fully eliminate the recreational use of drugs like this, as long as people want to use them. And so what we get is a sort of escalating cat and mouse dynamic, right? And if you want to use sort of a medical analogy here, you could think of this as like an incomplete course of antibiotics. You'll eliminate some of the bacteria, but the bacteria that remains may be strengthened, right? And so again, this is what we saw during Prohibition, right? You make alcohol legal, you get organized crime. Same thing that we saw during the crack epidemic, right? You close down a crack house and the sort of activity disperses, and you make things more expensive, right? You increase the ability to make profits off of this, and you get some people willing to step in and fill that void. So my claim is that this is a dynamic that we probably want to avoid, right? And now, I don't, in a sense, claim any originality for this point. So this is August Vollmer, largely considered the father of modern policing. He was the guy who pioneered lie detector tests, fingerprint databases. He first got his officers onto bicycles, and then when the Model T rolled off the line, got his officers into the patrol car. So in many ways, right, responsible for the professionalized police forces that we see today. And he wrote this, I think, actually kind of entertainingly, like sarcastic, sardonic essay in 1928 about how if you ask police officers to enforce traffic laws and vice laws, then they're not going to be doing the stuff we really want them to do, which is the enforcement of serious crime, right? Or laws against serious crime. You're not going to be able to have police officers focusing lots of their activity on reducing the murder rate if they're writing traffic tickets if they are arresting people for sex work, if they are arresting people for drug use, right? Because there will always be more or less vice in every fair-sized community, no matter how honest and efficient the law enforcement officials may be. In some sense, I think that this attitude has sort of maybe left the law enforcement profession a little bit, and that's sort of unfortunate, right? Okay, and part of this, I claim, is because of political expectations of the police, right? If you're not a police officer, you might think, oh, it's just easy, right? Just enforce the law. Make the bad guys stop doing what they're doing, and then everything will be fine. But as Vollmer pointed out, it's far from easy to do that. And so these expectations are unrealistic, right? Okay, so that's a problem. Too many people are dying of overdose deaths, and the standard law enforcement response that we've been sort of plugging away at for decades is largely ineffective. Okay, so what's the answer? Well, in some sense, I think the answer is like, I don't know. This is a really complicated problem. There's not going to be a silver bullet solution here. There's not one thing that we can do to fix the problem. Probably we'll have to engage in a lot of partial fixes. And lots of the really effective stuff is going to have to come from the medical profession because this is a medical problem. But what that means is that law enforcement agencies need to rethink their role here. So recall the professional disagreement that we started with. Should law enforcement officers carry Narcan or not? So there's a growing push to equip officers with Narcan, but it's sort of ineffective, right? So there's about 482 law enforcement agencies in Indiana, but only 39 or so equip their officers with Narcan. Now, in some sense, this is an unfair comparison because not all of these agencies should be expected to carry Narcan, right? If you're sort of like an airport cop or something like that, maybe, right, there's no sense in you being equipped with Narcan, but probably more than 40 agencies should be able to deploy Narcan, right? Okay, now how do we get there, right? How do you get to that conclusion? Well, I think what you have to do is go back to sort of this fundamental distinction in policing, and that is between order maintenance and law enforcement policing. Right? So this is a distinction that basically every police scholar is going to be familiar with. And to get a sense of what the difference is here, the paradigmatic law enforcement officer is a detective. A detective gets called in when a law has been broken. They investigate the crime. They assist in the prosecution. Their entire goal is the enforcement of the law and aiding in punishment for breaking the law. Patrol officers, on the other hand, are engaged in a different kind of policing, and that's policing that we'll call order maintenance policing. Now, one of the things that a patrol officer will do is enforce the law, but that's not all that they do, right? They usually, if you go back right to like James Wilson, one of the authors of the Broken Windows paper, he describes this in terms of handling the situation, right? The goal is to handle the situation, the dispute, right, whatever it may be, rather than make an arrest. Now, criminal arrest is a tool in the toolkit here, but it's not the ultimate goal, right? If it's possible to handle a situation without making an arrest, often a patrol officer and order maintenance officer will aim to do just that. So adult humor warning here. Here we have Overheard on Duty. This is a pseudonymous police Twitter account. And this has got to be the funniest example of order maintenance policing that I have come across. So someone called the police in reference to a trespassing. The officer gets there, and there are two grown men arguing about who is standing 2 inches over the property line. Right, this is what they called the cops for, to report this trespassing. The officer says, "I feel bad for their wives if they are fighting so much over 2 inches." Now, this is like crude humor, but it's police humor, right, to be expected. The point here is that the officer could have made an arrest. He could have said, all right, where is the property line actually? Okay, one of you is trespassing and one of you would like to file a charge. Let me make an arrest and bring you down to the station, right? But rather, he made this crude joke. He says he got a complaint, but it was worth it, right? Petty problems require petty solutions. They never called the police for that stupidity again. So here we have this police officer solving this problem without making an arrest. Now, order maintenance, non-law enforcement policing is not reserved just for things like this. Right? So if we go back to the 80s, right, there's this consensus that foot patrol is rather ineffective and we need to do something else. Right? And Kelly and Wilson proposed this new kind of policing, which in a sense is really a return to the order maintenance roots of urban police forces, where what we do is we focus on order maintenance, not necessarily law enforcement, right? Police should return to their order maintenance roots, and that's how we will sort of preserve communities and stop this cycle of urban decay. Now, there's a bunch going on in the Broken Windows paper. There's a crime thesis, a safety thesis, a deterrence thesis. What interests me is the safety thesis. The thought is that maintaining order will make people feel safer, more likely to use their community, more likely to walk around outside, right, and enforce the social norms that you need in order to preserve a kind of order in a community. Now, here's what they have to say, right? Arresting a single drunk or a single vagrant who has harmed no identifiable person seems unjust, and in a sense it is, but failing to do anything about a score of drunks or so on can destroy an entire community. It fails to take into account the connection between one broken window and 1,000 broken windows. So this claim is that by allowing disorder to flourish, you invite the cycle of disorder which can eventually, right, kick off more serious crime problems. What's interesting about the Broken Windows essay, though, is that it was written before the crime decline in the 90s, and before that decline, you don't see them necessarily claiming that this is going to eliminate crime. They're sort of, you know, they think that it might, there's a possibility that it will, but this isn't the primary reason to engage in this kind of policing, right? Say, how can a neighborhood be safer when the crime rate has not gone down? What they point out is that perceptions of safety are not always related to the actual crime rate. They're rather related to perceptions of physical and social disorder, right? So what foot patrol officers did was to elevate, to the extent they could, the level of public order in these neighborhoods. Okay, now, Broken Windows policing was enforced famously in New York City under the Giuliani administration with William Bratton as head of the NYPD. And what they did was kind of collapse this distinction between order maintenance and law enforcement policing. They attempted to maintain order by making aggressive, low-level law enforcement a priority, right? And the squeegee men were a serious problem. Apparently the New York Post thinks that they're back. This is a real problem. But what you see is this dynamic where after the decline, proponents of Broken Windows policing say, we were right, aggressive low-level law enforcement is the key. But notice that this just abandons the goal of maintaining order in a community, right? Because again, one of the results of this kind of policing is that you, in a lot of ways, can destroy communities, and maintaining communities was the end of the Broken Windows strategy. Okay, so a quick detour through some public health material here. And now, during the HIV and AIDS crisis, there was this problem with people suffering, not getting the care that they need. And so what happened? Members of the community teamed up with medical professionals to engage in these harm reduction strategies that were much more effective than abstinence strategies, right? So at this time, the thought was, well, if you don't want AIDS, then you shouldn't have gay sex. And now, of course, we know that that's not an effective response, right? It wasn't until we started trying to figure out how we can make this behavior less harmful that we actually got a handle on this problem. Now, what's interesting is that the groups that are responsible for harm reduction in the opioid epidemic are the same groups that were responsible for harm reduction strategies during the HIV/AIDS crisis. So in Buffalo, you have Evergreen Health. In New Orleans, you have Crescent Care. These were originally organizations aimed at treating the HIV and AIDS crisis. They still engage in this sort of work, but they also now have things like needle exchange programs, right? Counseling for people who are using and would like not to. And the thought is you bring people in a sort of stigma-free environment, and you help them eventually get the counseling that they need, right? So these groups don't think that, like, if we just get dirty syringes off of the street and give people who want to use them clean syringes, that there we go, problem solved, right? That's not the right way to think about this problem, but rather, given that this problem is not going to be solved overnight, in the meantime, we want to make this less dangerous, and in the long term, we want to connect people with the kind of care that they need in order to get them to stop using, right? So what does harm reduction in the public health sphere look like? Things like housing support or wound treatment, things like stigma-free education, right? So like one of the things that they will encourage people to do is if there's new product around, go easy at first, right? Use with a buddy. Use with someone who has access to Narcan. Now, in some sense, there's a moral hazard problem here, right? If you make it less risky to use, you'll probably increase the rates at which people use. But that's why it's really important that they're paired with different kinds of treatment and counseling options, right? And so in addition, right, you have Narcan use and training, the syringe exchange programs where you can get a clean syringe if you bring in a dirty one. And sort of all the way at the extreme end of the spectrum, you have supervised injection sites. Supervised injection sites are really effective ways of getting people who are using to not die while they're using, right? But they're politically unpopular and they're controversial because it's not clear to a lot of people whether we should be facilitating this sort of behavior. All right, so why are the syringe exchange programs important? Well, in areas without them, it's relatively common to come across used syringes on the ground. And it's really common for people to reuse needles. And this spreads HIV, hepatitis C. And the more that you use a needle, the more deformed the needle gets, the more likely it is that you're going to seriously injure yourself while using it, right? Your wound might get infected, so on and so forth, right? Okay, so back to the policing issue, right? Notice that this mirrors a professional ethics question in medicine, right? Is it permissible for a physician to assist in someone's death, right? Is physician-assisted suicide permissible? What we have here is a tension between healing and helping. So physician-assisted suicide does not heal the patient, right? Rather, it uses medical knowledge to help patients. And it used to be that there was very little room for this kind of work in the medical field, right? There was a time when there was no such thing as palliative care. The only kind of care that you could get was curative. And the medical profession thought that their only goal was healing. We recognize that we can keep people alive for a very long time, beyond the point at which they have lives that are plausibly worth living, or at least to the point where they're not sort of experiencing a lot of well-being. The medical community rethought this, and they're still in the process of doing that, right? It's not like physician-assisted suicide is sort of like legal everywhere. But palliative care is a good example of this goal of helping being made more prominent when the goal of healing is sort of off the table. And so there's a clear analogy here to the law enforcement profession's response to the opioid epidemic, right? If it turns out that making arrests and aiding incarceration doesn't solve the problem, well, maybe the law enforcement response should be sort of downplayed a little bit here, and the sort of service-oriented helping response should be made more prominent, right? So the question is, right, how can some officers facilitate drug use, reduce the risks associated with drug use, while others try to impede and deter it? And the answer is just that professions have more than one goal, more than one value that they're trying to serve, right? And the reason it's important to go back to the roots of sort of urban policing, the order maintenance policing strategy that I claimed has sort of been misunderstood a little bit in the aftermath of the Broken Windows policing essay and the crime decline in the 90s, is that the police often engage in work that is not aimed at enforcing the law. And if that means that order maintenance, non-law enforcement policing counts as good police work, we can just eliminate this tension by eliminating this overly narrow conception of policing. If it's not the case that what the police do is enforce the law, and rather at least a large part of what the police do is help communities maintain order, then there's much less of a puzzle here, much less tension, right? And here's another example, again taken from Twitter, of a kind of harm reduction, order maintenance policing, right? So this officer says he's on the scene of a stabbing. It appears that someone had a sex worker come to his place and he refused to pay, so the sex worker stabbed him. Says, this is the second time I've had to tweet this in a month. Pay your sex workers. This is a kind of order maintenance policing, right? Now ultimately the goal might be to eliminate sex work, right? I mean, what you think about that is going to depend on a whole bunch of other political questions or sort of political disputes here. But independently of all of that, this is a thing that happens. How can you make it less harmful? Well, you engage in harm reduction, order maintenance policing, right? But not everyone agrees. And so here is a response to this post, right? Or don't hire prostitutes. So one thing that's interesting to point out here is that the harm-reducing police officer uses the term sex worker, whereas the typical law enforcement oriented officer, right, uses the term prostitute. So there's very different levels of respect being used, right, when thinking about the relevant parties here. So again, the point is just that order maintenance policing counts as good policing. And if it's more effective than a law enforcement response, it's a kind of response that should be on the table, right? So let's return to that safety thesis from the Broken Windows policing paper, which says that maintaining order will make people feel safer even if we don't reduce crime. Making people feel safer is a genuine service that the police provide. This is a genuine, honorable goal of policing. And it seems clear, to me anyway, that overdose deaths count as a kind of disorder. And if one genuine goal of policing is the reduction of disorder, then one genuine goal of policing can be activities that reduce this problem, right? That means that harm reduction strategies employed by the police count as order maintenance policing, right? Harm reduction counts as order maintenance. And if order maintenance is a core part of policing, then harm reduction can be a core part of policing as well. So that means there's no reason, I think, to stop at carrying Narcan, though, right, one political battle at a time. It seems like when we have a properly conceived police ethics, right, there's room for this kind of policing. Now, it's worth thinking about this further aspect, right? Let's return to the law enforcement aspect of policing, because you might accuse me of just ignoring the law enforcement aspect by focusing entirely on order maintenance here. But one of the things that we're really sure of, right, there's sort of mountains of empirical evidence about this in the criminology and economics of crime literature, is that in order to engage in law enforcement policing, in order to arrest people who are killing, who are robbing, who are raping, so on and so forth, you need the trust of the community. You need community involvement, right? If you don't have sources of information in the community, if you don't have community buy-in, you're never going to solve even a minority of homicides, right? You need buy-in from the community. And when we engage in harsh policing, like we see in the New York City 1990s, early 2000s manifestation of broken windows policing, you get a decrease in trust from the community. And with that decrease in trust, with that decrease in community buy-in, you get less effective homicide departments. You get less effective homicide detectives, right? So less trust means less cooperation means less clearance rates. So there's a real sense in which making room for order maintenance policing will also improve the kinds of law enforcement policing that, right, are uncontroversially a core part of policing, right? Okay, so recall this dispute that sort of motivated the talk here. If we recognize that Sheriff Leahy is engaged in good policing, then more people like Leahy are likely to want to become police officers. And that means that we'll change our selection effects, right? Rather than selecting for sort of warrior cops, we'll select for cops who are more likely to win the trust and buy-in of their community, more likely to reduce harm, more likely to maintain order, and more likely to enforce the uncontroversial laws that we want them to enforce, right? Okay, so properly conceived, there's room for harm reduction, order maintenance policing that not only can reduce the severity of the opioid epidemic, right, or whatever the next drug epidemic happens to be, it can also increase the other kinds of policing that we like to see from law enforcement agencies, right? Now, is this going to solve the problem? Definitely not entirely. At best, this is going to just reduce the severity of the problem, but there's, room for these kinds of solutions. There are problems that just don't have perfect solutions. Sometimes the best that we can do is kind of muddle through, but at the very least, we can ensure that those professionals in the community that are ill-suited to solving the problem are not the ones that take themselves to be sort of leading the charge, right? What we want are people better suited to handling this problem, and those are physicians pioneering different kinds of strategies to help people reach and maintain sobriety, right? So the point here is that even though it's not a silver bullet solution, it is an improvement over the existing strategies, right? And this is, again, important because this is unlikely to be the last drug epidemic we see, the last serious problem that we see, and we need clarity about what good policing looks like in order to appropriately address it. All right, I'll stop there, thanks.
Any questions?